Okay, Parshas Noach is okay. So
Recording.
yes, I am recording. Okay, because the Parshas Noach is the parsha that deals with the story of the flood, and there were incredible messages that need to be gotten from Parshas Noach. And the truth is that we could talk for hours and hours and hours about many of the details of the parsha, but I want to deal with something that I think is really germane to many of the themes that we've talked about in the past couple of Mishnayos, and which to me, in fact, is really a very critical issue in living Judaism. The Torah tells us Noach ish tzaddik tamim hoya b'darosav, that Noach was a righteous man. He was tamim, he was pure in his generations. So Rashi brings the very famous discussion between the sages of what does it mean that he was righteous in his generations. And Rashi says that yesh dorshim l'shvach v'yesh dorshim l'gnai. There are those that expound it in a positive way, and there are those that expound it in a negative way. Those that expound it in a positive way say that despite the fact that his generation was so sparse and was so down and so sinful, Noach was able to rise above that, and he was able to be a tzaddik in a generation of such wickedness. Yesh Doshim Lignai, there were those who look at it in a negative way, and they say that had Noach been in another generation, then he wouldn't have really amounted to much. In fact, he was in a terrible generation. He was surrounded by people that were so low, so therefore he looked so great. But if we put him in a generation of Avram Avinu, of Abraham, then he never would have amounted really to anything. The only problem that I have with that Rashi, and it works either way. The way the words of the Torah are that he was an ish tzaddik, he was a righteous man, bidorosav in his generation, and it explains the concept of his generations. But why do you have to darshan it lignai? The Torah says positive. The Torah says Noach ish tzaddik. He was a righteous person. He was tamim hoya bidorosav. He was a good person according to the Torah. He was a righteous person according to the Torah. The Torah didn't say Noach ish mediocre, right? It didn't say he was a powerful person. The Torah said that he was an ish tzaddik tamim hoya b'darasav. So why do we feel compelled to have to look at that in a negative kind of way? There's another very troubling part of the parsha. Noach, it tells us that the waters the rain started to come, and the waters started to rise. And then it says that Noach got into the teva, he got into the ark with his family and with all the things that he had stored inside of the ark. And what's fascinating is that the Midrashim say that it took Noach until the water reached his neck to go into the boat. And as Rashi brings down from the sages, that he was miktane amana. Mikitane amana means that he was like from the small ones of faith. And therefore he was hedging his bets. As soon as it started to rain, he wasn't sure whether in fact this was the flood that God was speaking about or not the flood. And therefore he didn't believe fully and he didn't get into the boat. I don't understand what that means. Here's a guy who's building a boat for 120 years. 120 years. Now, during those 120 years, what was happening? People were walking by Noach and they were saying to him, "Yo, Noah, good morning. How you doing? What are you doing?" And Noach said, "I'm building a boat." And you know what people said? What people asked him? What's a boat? Because what did they know from a boat? But boat hadn't yet been invented in the world. They were living in the middle of Mesopotamia. It wasn't like there was a Mesopotamian yacht club. Like, what did they know from boats? So Noach is saying, he's clapping away, right? He's taking the nails and he's building the boat. And they're saying to him, Noach, what are you doing? Well, it's going to rain. You're all going to die. And this boat is going to save us. The guy is saying this message for 120 years. After 120 years, it starts to rain. And Noach looks in and goes, I wonder what's going to happen. should I get in the boat or not? What's the matter with you? You were building this thing for 120 years. And that's what it means, miketane amanaya, that he was from the small of faith, that somehow he didn't believe. I don't understand how that's possible. How are you capable of doing something for 120 years to save yourself, your family, and the world, and yet when it starts to rain, you're almost drowned, and then you say, I guess this is it. I guess it's time for me to get in the boat. How does that happen to a person? My third problem, 120 years you're hacking and clapping away, telling people you're going to die. And you know how many people you influenced? 0. 0. He didn't influence his kids, his daughters, and his sons-in-law. He didn't influence them, his wife. They were, they bought into the program. He was able to have an influence on no one. How depressing is that? 120 years, you're telling people they're going to die. Not one person even buys a ticket on the boat just to hedge their bets. The only person that grabbed on, according to the Medrash, was a fellow by the name of Og Melech HaBashan. Og, the king of Bashan, was a giant fellow who, probably could have done well without the boat also, but he hung on to the boat. But nobody else went on. The animals, it wasn't like they bought the message. They were brought onto the boat. They were schlepped onto the boat. How do you speak a message for 120 years and you influence no one? Avram Avinu never went over to a person to tell him that if he didn't believe in God, he was going to die. Avram Avinu never really went over to a person to tell him that, God runs the world. Avram Avinu set up a tent, and he set up a little restaurant inside of the tent, and people would come, and he would offer them food, and they would say, how much? And Avram Avinu would say, nothing, I don't charge. Wow, what a deal. I'll come back tomorrow. And all Avram Avinu would ask of them is that they would make a bracha, make a blessing. Bless God. It was almost like Noah's boat, because just like they didn't know what a boat was, they didn't know what a blessing was. So they would say to Avram, okay, what's a blessing? He would teach them what a bracha is. He would teach them what it means to be thankful and grateful to God. And then that began the conversation. And from there, he created a generation of monotheists. In a world of idolatry, he created a generation of monotheists. He had an incredible effect on the world, to the extent that when it says that when he left with all of the souls that he had made. He built up people. How is it possible that Avraham Avinu could have such an influence on the world? And Noach, who this was his profession, right? He was a kiruv professional, wasn't able to influence not one person. So I think that what we have to understand from this is that Noach was what we call like a Shulchan Aruch Yid. Noach was a person that followed the rules. God said to him that he should build an ark, no problem. This is the dimensions of the ark, 30 by 300 by 50, no problem. I want you to build it this way. I want you to take this kind of animal into the boat. I want you to take 7 of these, 2 of these, no problem. But everything that Noah did, it was following rules, but it wasn't changing his heart. It wasn't something that was a part of Noah. There was no fire inside of him. There was no energy inside of him. And that's what Rashi means when he says the miketane amana, that he was from the small ones of faith. It's not that he had a problem with faith in God. He would ask him, he believed absolutely, fully in God. But that was only externally. It never made it into his soul. It never made it into his depths. When Noach would tell people he was building an ark because the world was going to be destroyed and they were going to all die, he was telling them the message that God told him to tell them. He wasn't saying it from his heart. He wasn't pouring out inside. I think I told you once a story There was a fellow that once came to a Rebbe during the time of the Tsar and the Tsarist army. What they would do is they would conscript young Jewish boys. And by the time they got out of the army, they were already no longer religious. They had beaten out religion from them because they had taken them at such a young age into the army. There were a lot of people that were looking for different kinds of ways to make sure their children would never have to go into the Tsar's army. And very often they would go to holy people to pray for them. So a fellow comes into the Rebbe and he says to this particular Rebbe that his son is going to be conscripted into the army. Could the Rebbe please pray on his behalf? The Rebbe said to the fellow, could you say it again? The fellow said, my son is going to be conscripted into the army. Could you pray on his behalf that he shouldn't get conscripted into the army? The Rebbe said, could you say that one more time? So the fellow said that my son is going to be conscripted into the army. And could the Rebbe please pray that he's not going to be conscripted and, intercede on his behalf? The Rebbe said to him, could you say it again? 10 times he told him to say it. And the guy repeated the message 10 times. After the 10th time, the Rebbe looks at the fellow and he says to him, get out of my office. I cannot believe that you are asking me to pray on your behalf that your son shouldn't go to the army. What an honor it is for us to fight in the Tsar's army. What a great schus it is for us to be part of this country and to go fight in the army. And he throws the guy out of his office. The Chassidim who heard the story were astounded. They couldn't believe what the Rebbe had done. A few weeks later, a delegation from the Tsar comes to see the Rebbe, and they give him an award. They give him a medal for a loyalist to the country, that he supports the country and supports the war effort and encourages his people to go to the army. Now the Chassidim were completely confused. How did the Rebbe know that this guy was the guy that came into his office was obviously a charlatan, and the guy came in, he was a spy from the government, and he was trying to trip up the Rebbe, and he wasn't able to. And that's why they gave the Rebbe a medal, because the Rebbe was able to withstand that, and he was, he realized that he was they were going to trick him, and he threw the guy out of the office, and he supported the country. He didn't support the country, but he did that because he knew that he was being watched. How did the Rebbe know this? They thought the Rebbe was what we call a Baal Meifis. They thought that he was somebody who could do tremendous tricks. He said, I didn't do any tricks. He said, when the guy came into me, he said that he talked to me about his son and about saving his son. He said it like deadpan. So I thought maybe, he's just a deadpan kind of person. So I told him to repeat it a second time. And he said it deadpan again the second time. And then he said it the same way the third time, and the same way the fourth time, and the same way the fifth time, as if he was repeating a speech. If somebody was coming in honestly to ask me to pray for their son, and I would ask them to repeat their thing a second time, their petition a third time, their petition a fourth time, by the time I got to the fifth time, they'd be on the floor crying and screaming and yelling, oh, Rebbe, help me. They'd be begging me. They would be filled with so much emotion. This person just said it the same way each time, because he was saying a speech. He was saying over what he was supposed to say. And therefore I knew that he was a spy. And I was able to understand exactly what he was trying to do. Because there's a great difference between doing something that's coming from your heart and doing something that's coming from your body. And that was the difference between Noach and Avram. Noach was somebody who did it from his body. He was a tzaddik. The Torah can't take that away from him. Noach ish tzaddik tamim haya b'darosav. He was an amazing person. But his amazingness was limited. It was limited to the externals, not to the internal. It wasn't something that had caught inside of him. It was something that had stayed outside of him. By Avram Avinu, it was something that just poured out of him. It poured out of him to an extent that he never really even needed to say anything. All he needed to do was to be. And it exuded from him. What's my proof that by Noach, it wasn't something that he was invested in internally? Because later in the parasha, after Noach gets out of the boat, it gives Noach another name. another description. Look at it carefully, the Shabbos. It says, Vayachol Noach ish ha'adama. He was called Noach ish tzadik in the beginning of the parsha. And after the flood, he was identified as an ish ha'adama, a man of the land, because he changed his very essence, because it was never really a part of him. Now he was living in a different world. He was living in a different kind of existence. He became a different kind of person because it wasn't something that was deep inside of him. What's the first thing that happens to Noach after he comes out of the boat? He builds a vineyard and he gets drunk. Now, what had stopped Noach all these years from falling into this abyss that he fell into after the boat? Because he always had his neighbors. At the end of the day, there were people around, and that Noach, if he didn't have his own internal compass, so at least he felt a certain sense of shame, a certain sense of responsibility to the neighbors around him. What are people going to say if I do this? When there were no people left in the world, there was nothing holding Noach in anymore, because it wasn't deep inside him. It was just something he did, not something he was. And therefore he was able to get drunk because there was nothing stopping him anymore, because there was nothing coming from his inside. There was nothing, it wasn't deeply embedded inside of him. If Noach reacted to the environment around him by being a tzaddik, not allowing himself to sink into the abyss that everybody else had sunk into, when later they built the Tower of Babel and Noach was still alive, why don't we hear about Noach? Why don't we hear that Noach sends a message to the people that are building the Tower of Babel to tell them, guys, God's going to kill you? Do you remember what happened the last time? Maybe you never heard about it. I should tell you the story about the flood and tell you what happened with the boat and tell you how you came to be. Noach doesn't say a word because he didn't feel anything. He wasn't motivated because it wasn't part of his insides. When he was required to do it, to speak up to the generation, he spoke up. But it wasn't something that was burning inside of him. And when it's all on the outside, it can do nothing and inspire no one. Why aren't Jews turning on the world? Why aren't Jews the beloved people in the world? Why aren't we having an incredible influence on the world? Because even though we're living a beautiful message and a beautiful life, we live with chesed, we live with kindness, we live with love, we live with devotion, we live with family values. But maybe as a nation, some of what we do is only external, and that it's not really something that is deeply embedded inside of us. That maybe the fire isn't there for us. See, Avraham Avinu lived his message. Noach spoke his message. And maybe in the generation that we're living in, maybe for many people, we're speaking a message and not necessarily living a message. And that's why it doesn't inspire. That's why it doesn't inspire very often the next generation. It doesn't inspire the people around us. You would think that a person that lives with Torah values would be a person that even people that don't live with Torah values would respect. I don't do that, but I'm so happy that you do. Look at the fine person that you are. Because maybe we are fine people. But maybe some of the fineness is only external fineness, and it's not deeply embedded fineness. And the proof is that it's not inspiring the world, and it's not lifting up the world. And even though it's tzidkus, it's righteousness, it's tamim, it's tmimus, but it's not deeply embedded tzidkus and tmimus, righteousness and pureness. Maybe that's why yesh darshim l'gnai. There's yesh darshim l'shvach. There are those that look at it in a positive way because they look at the positive side of Noach. But when they realized that the positive side of Noach had limitations because it wasn't this deeply embedded thing, it was like a coat that he put on. It was like a Purim costume. It wasn't something that was his identity. So then yesh darshim l'gnai, then we have to look at it in a different way. Not running down Noach. We're not saying Noach is a negative person. We're recognizing Noach's limitations. Because when we can recognize Noach's limitations, so then we can break through our own limitations. It's good to hear sometimes about Noach and to explain Noach's limitations, because then I can look at myself and I can say, why don't I have that kind of Abrahamic influence on the world around me? Because maybe I'm more like Noach than I am Abraham. Maybe there's more of me that is actions, deeds, things I do, but not necessarily the identity of who I am. This past week, we really just spent in the Mishnayos so much talking about this idea, where it's just external things and not internal things. And that's why we make mistakes in halacha. That's the reason why that's the way to get a crown on our head, by making it something that's internal. Maybe that's the thing that our generation has to work on, is taking the things we do, which we thank God do, but to take them and make them not just the things we do, but to make them into our identity, make them into the people that we are. Like we said, Noach spoke his message, but maybe we need to be more like Avram, who lived his message. My thoughts about the Pasha. Something to chew over Shabbos. Okay, just a little housekeeping. So first of all, a beautiful Shabbos to everyone. We should have an uplifting, a beautiful, amazing Shabbos. I think that for the sake of my family and their sanity, for me, I'm insane anyway. It doesn't make a difference. But for my family and everyone that's coming in for the wedding, I think that that next week is going to be a difficult week for me. So I think that what I will do is that we won't have class next week. The following week it will be partially in America and then coming back to Eretz Yisrael. But I think by the time I get settled in Eretz Yisrael, it'll be Shabbos already. So in Yirtzeh Hashem, on Sunday, November 8th, we'll continue class again. But I will put out something for Shabbos next week. I'll put it on the Zoom and on the Torah, and then I will also the following week Parshas Vayira. So we will do those two parshas, the next two parshas, just by putting something out, and then we'll pick up Pirkei Avos Sunday morning, back to Sundays, and we'll be on Israel time and normal Israel time. Sunday morning, November 8th is when we'll pick up again. So I hope everybody can handle a 2-week break without breaking completely. And Amir Hashem will reconvene in 2 weeks' time.
Mazel tov and shkoyach, Rabbi.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Your family.
Mazel tov, Shabbat Shalom, and warmest regards from Dina.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Everybody should have a beautiful Shabbos.
You too.